like to welcome everybody that just joined us. Thank you for being here. I'm here with Albert Berchtold and Michael Knight of USPA. How's it going, guys?
Doing great, Dave. Doing great.
Great, Dave. Thanks for having us. Appreciate the time.
And I guess maybe just some brief introductions. Albert, you are the executive director now of USPA for what, a little over a year now. Is that right?
A little bit longer than that. So I've been in the executive director role for 3 years now. Time
Oh,
flies.
geez, time.
And prior to that, I was a volunteer member of USPA's board for 8 years.
Okay. And Michael, you have taken the government relations position and you've been in that job for, maybe it was you I was thinking, is about a little over a year now. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's been a little over 2 years now. But yeah, I mean, the time flying since I've been on. But yeah, it's been, I think, about just over 2 years since I've been on, and it's been going really well. Yeah.
So the topic of discussion tonight revolves around this call to action that USPA put out, what, maybe about 4 or 5 weeks ago, Albert. I think you and I did an interview with it about 3 weeks ago. And tonight we're going to kind of dig into that a little deeper with both of you. And then at the end of our discussion, then we're going to open it up for question and answer with any of you that are in the audience there. And you could be putting those questions right now into the chat. That's the way to ask a question, is to enter it into the chat. And then we will likely get to those more towards the end. But to start with, I guess maybe, I don't know which one of you wants to open up, maybe with you, Albert. What is the FAA reauthorization? What is the purpose of it? And then maybe what's some of the verbiage in it that is not so good for us?
Yeah. So thanks, Dave. First off, thanks everybody for being here. Those of you that are tuned in, happy to have you. FAA reauthorization is something that occurs every 5 years, and it's a process that occurs in our government every 5 years. And the language that we're looking in there that relates to skydiving, it's buried. It's FAA reauthorization in total is a pretty long document, 500 plus pages, and buried somewhere in there, I think it's around 300, page 300. And so is a little section called Air Tour and Sport Parachuting Safety. And it has some parts in there that discuss general aviation. There's some parts in there that are directed towards changes in the air tour industry, helicopters and such. And then there's some language in there that's directed towards sport skydiving and parachuting. So we, to give you a little bit more information on that language, we've got to do, I guess, a little bit of a history lesson first. And we can go into that. And it kind of all starts back in 2008. And if we go back to 2008, there was a special report done by the NTSB, and they made a number of recommendations to skydiving, to sport jumping in that special report. 12, I believe, in total. 8 of them were directed towards the FAA, and 4 of them were directed towards USPA. And each of those went through a process of data gathering, and they looked to the FAA to respond to many of those. And USPA responded to the ones towards the FAA, as well as the ones directed directly towards us. And many of those recommendations ended up with some really good things coming, safety related to our sport. You know, some changes that we made, some changes that the FAA made, that if we look back now 15 years, we can say that some of those changes that were made in 2008 definitely had a positive change on our sport and the safety of it when it comes to aircraft, the likelihood of aircraft fatalities, the safety of our aircraft. So all good things there. There were 3 recommendations in that report that the FAA rejected. And they rejected it based on their view of them, as well as looking at some facts and data and analysis on those 3 topics. 2 of those were related to aircraft pilot training and recurrency. And one of them was directed towards aircraft maintenance. And the reason I bring those up is because we're going to talk about them again, because they've now come back up. So if we fast forward from that 2008 special report and we go to 2019, We have there was an unfortunate incident that occurred out in Hawaii, Dillingham Airfield. There was a King Air that crashed shortly after takeoff, and that ended with the aircraft crashing, rolling over shortly after takeoff, and all 11 people on that aircraft died. It's a very unfortunate incident, very tragic. All 11 folks on board, jumpers, including the pilot on board, perished in that crash. At the same time, Hawaii was having a number of issues in their air tour industry as well. They had some unfortunate things going on in the helicopter world. It's a very busy, very, very busy place for tourism and air tour industry. So what was going on in air tours, as well as what had just happened in the parachute world with that King Air crash, caused a senator there to decide to try and make some changes for the positive. And what he did at that time was he pulled those 3 recommendations from that NTSB report from 11 years prior, and he saw those as unanswered, or not unanswered, but not accepted. And he put together a bill called the Air Tour and Sport Parachuting Safety. It was actually called Skydiving Safety Act at that point. And he began working with us. We had some communication with their office, as well as he worked with some other associations, the Manufacturers Association and Helicopter Association on the helicopter points, and some other groups. And at that point, USPA went to work and pulled together facts and data and analysis to see if those recommendations were valid at this point, if things had changed in the last 11 or 12 years since they were originally proposed. And what we found by looking at the facts and the data was that while they were rejected 11 years ago, the same logic and reason for why they were rejected 11 years ago was still valid and was still sound. And in fact, the safety record of the sport of skydiving had only gotten better in the last 11 years. So we looked at those, we provided those facts and data to the senator's office, and we actually made some counter recommendations based on looking at them again and trying to find ways that they could maybe enact some additional safety into the sport of skydiving. Michael, do you want to take it from there?
You were on quite the roll there. Yeah. So I was, you were doing so well. I kind of was getting lost enjoying the history lesson there.
I can keep going with my history lesson. I don't want to monopolize the whole call though. So I can kind of lead into, I guess the next step was we went back and forth, and actually the recommendations that we had made were when we looked at everything, we realized that the sport didn't necessarily need more regulation. What we needed was better adherence to the existing regulations. So when we looked at the crashes that had occurred in the last 10 years, and then even those before, what we saw was that most of the crashes weren't a situation where a new regulation was needed, but many of them were attributed to people who were not following the existing regulations that were on the books, the FARs and the FAA regulations and guidance that they put out. So our recommendation actually back was that we didn't necessarily need more regulation, but we needed better adherence to those regulations. And the senator at that point took those comments and he continued to move forward with his with those 3 points from the NTSB report. There was efforts to put them into the NDAA bill in 2022. There were efforts to put it into omnibus at the end of 2022, and that language did not make it into either of those bills. We were actually happy to see that at the end of 2022, there was something in the omnibus bill, which is a government funding bill that called for, I believe it was $11.2 million for 110 new FAA safety inspectors, which is very much what we directed our conversation towards. Was we need better adherence to existing regulations, and that might mean more FAA inspections. And that's a really tough thing to say, because I'm sure a lot of our drop zone operators, they don't throw a big party when the FAA inspector shows up. But the truth of the matter is that the vast majority of our drop zone operators who are doing everything right in the way they're supposed to be doing it, they have no issues when the FAA inspector shows up and does a ramp check, because they have all their books in order. They're doing everything according to the regulations. And an FAA inspector showing up shouldn't be something to be worried about. And in many cases, they might see something that the drop zone operator may not have been aware of, or may have overlooked, in which case they take that corrective action and they move on, and it's a positive relationship. So that's kind of the direction we went for. And we were happy to see that got put in there in Omnibus. We were a little bit dismayed when we saw the FAA reauthorization come around in early 2023. And those same 3 recommendations had made it into FAA reauthorization on the Senate side of things.
And that is, how often does that come around? Is that about every 5 years? Is that right?
That's correct. FAA reauthorization comes around every 5 years, and it's, what you'll see in there is things from various legislators around the United States directed towards FAA, which many of them are to resolve issues that exist in various parts of aviation. Some to do with general aviation, like this language is directed towards. A lot of it directed towards the commercial side of things as well.
Well, maybe we can dig down into I think you said there's kind of 3. There's 2 that are on the training side and 1 that's on the maintenance side. So maybe we can start with the training side. Michael, can you tell us a little bit about what these 2, the wording and what it is they want to impose on the industry?
Yeah, so the 2 for the training, it's training and testing, really. There's 2 recommendations that are very similar in what they're asking for, and it's asking for annual recurrent pilot training, and then also initial jump pilot testing is the other one. So both of those would ask for testing of jump pilots on weight and balance calculations, egress procedures, which is like, during the exit, as the weight shifting, specific training related to that. But all the training that is requested in those recommendations would be redundant to current commercial jump pilot or commercial pilot training. So that's why the FAA rejected those in the initial go around. Those recommendations would be redundant, and they would also create an additional barrier to entry for jump pilots, which would make it harder for operators to get jump pilots, and it would just really clog the system in a way that would not be beneficial to the system and would be overburdensome to pilots interested in flying for jump operations. So for those reasons, the FAA chose to reject that provision and not take that up at the time. And we see those reasonings as consistent in today's world, where it would just be redundant and, again, harder to acquire jump pilots for operators in this moving forward. So we continue to oppose that recommendation.
And when you say it's redundant, right now the way it works, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you have a biannual flight review. And are you saying basically what they're asking for requirements is all stuff that would be part of that biannual review?
Yes. Yeah, and as part of, like you say, a part of the initial training of getting your commercial pilot's license, and it would be also covered in a biannual flight review. So this additional step to certify a jump pilot and keep a jump pilot training, it would just be more difficult to keep pilots in the industry.
If this were to go forward, who would write the rules on that? Would FAA write that training program?
Well, yeah. There's a lot to it, because this has a long way to go. So with the way I guess we're just basing everything on the way the bill is currently written. And again, I guess we can kind of get into that whole part of it, where right now the language is in the Senate bill only. The House has already passed their bill they've passed their FAA reauthorization bill, and this language related to air tours and skydiving is not included in that bill. So the 2 bills are going to have to come together at some point soon, and this whole item of Air Tours and Sport Parachuting Safety Act will need to be negotiated. So there could be changes to that language, and it could be eliminated altogether still moving forward. Obviously, that's what we're working towards, is having this language removed from the current FAA reauthorization bill. If it does move forward and say it does pass and is included and becomes into law in its current form as it is written, the next step would be the Congress would be asking the FAA to develop and administer an aviation rulemaking committee. And that committee, which is administered by the FAA, would take these recommendations and boil them down and have to really analyze them on what would be needed and how that would work in the system. And so there's a long way to go in this whole thing, because again, the FAA has already rejected these in the past. They have shared similar language on the similar opinions on these recommendations recently. So how they would see that moving forward and getting implemented, if these were, even necessary, even if they felt they were necessary now, how that whole plays out is still to be seen. And USPA has requested and would insist on having a seat in that rulemaking committee to express our opinions in a way that makes sure that anything that is implemented is fair and reasonable to jump operators moving forward.
So not only would it be redundant if it went through, but also it's gonna make it, I think, Albert, you brought something up on the interview we did. If a new pilot, our industry has a lot of turnover, by the way. I work on the aviation side in the skydiving industry, and the turnover it's almost yearly. Like, if we can keep a guy for 2 seasons, we've done really, really well. Because they need about 1,000 hours to start. And once they get to 1,500, they can go wherever they want. And so the turnover is high, and it's becoming more and more difficult to hire all the time. And Albert, you brought up a good point the last time we spoke. If a 1,000-hour guy can go get that additional 500 hours towing banners or being a CFI, there's all kinds of other paths that he doesn't have to do this jump through these additional hoops. That's going to make it even harder for us to hire within the industry.
Yeah, exactly. They could take on doing, crop dusting or towing banners or something like that. And when they're looking for that position, if they look at the possibility of becoming a jump pilot and they see an additional layer of work that needs to be done, an additional certification that needs to be attained, which much of the items in that would likely be redundant to their commercial, the work they have to do to maintain their commercial rating, then they may just go, you know what, I'm just not going to bother with that. I'll go tow banners up and down the beach, because that doesn't require me to have this additional item to do general aviation flying.
Yeah, I think it's also worth pointing out that it is in the drop zone owners' best interest to have good programs in place. There's a free market component that should make a good DZO want to have really good, safe, well-trained pilots.
Absolutely, and having a training program and having them stay up to date on various things that are related to weight balance and egress procedures and all that kind of stuff is important. And that's something that USPA has a resource for as well, for those that are looking to develop that. If they for some reason don't have it through USPA's site, we've got a template on there for drop zone operators to use as a starting point for developing their own, if they're either a new operator or it's time to update theirs.
All right, so that
is actually one of the things that came around post that special report from the NTSB back in 2008, was that the development of that educational program.
Okay, so let's move to the maintenance side now, because as much of a kind of a hassle and difficulty it would put on hiring for drop zones, I think the real cost to drop zones comes more from some of the maintenance suggestions that are happening. So, Michael, can you take us through what it is that this language would have us do?
Yeah, so the third recommendation, or I guess on the bill, it's the first recommendation, would require jump operators to follow engine manufacturers' service bulletins and recommendations for time between overhauls. And that's really the big measure that has concerned us, because that would really not increase the cost to operate an aircraft for a jump operator significantly. And that's, to us, that's the measure that would really hurt the industry the most. So that's the one that has the community the most interested in learning about, and that's the one we're opposing it as hard as we can.
So can you explain the difference to us? What the difference between TBO and, say, like a 135 operation versus how the way we do it in the Part 91 world?
Yeah, in the Part 135 world, a TBO and the service bulletins that come from engine manufacturers those operators are required to follow those already. So they're already required to follow those, and they must comply with the recommendations. In Part 91, we are not forced to follow TBO or the service bulletins. Obviously, all the operators must still follow the airworthiness directives, and we also get to comply with the 100-hour inspections, or if you're on a turbine and you have an FAA approved program, you could follow those, but you're not held to the same restrictions as the Part 135 world, which follows TBO and service bulletins. So this, right now, we have that little more leniency in that.
For some of the people listening, what is TBO? Maybe we should explain what that is.
Yeah, it's just time between overhaul or time before overhaul. And that's the time in which the engine must be completely dismantled and overhauled by an approved service provider. And then so at that time, you're either replacing the engine completely or buying a freshly overhauled, or waiting the long time for your engine to get overhauled and returned. So it can either be, but either way you do that, it's a significant cost to the operation. It's a very costly for anybody to do that, and it can be also significant downtime for the aircraft.
And the way it works now is kind of on an on-condition basis. Is that right? Where the mechanics can tear the engine down, they can look at components, they've got a thing called a borescope that's kind of like a little camera they can wind in there, and they can look at all the rotables and all the expensive parts that need to get replaced, and they can say, well, no, this is fine. We can go for another 100 hours and look at it again. Is that a fair layman's description of the way it works in our world?
Yeah, that is pretty fair. And then there's wear limits on all these parts to where they can compare them to new parts, or what the manufacturer considers, a part that is worn beyond use. So you can inspect the part, compare it to the specs, and if it's still within operating range, you can return it to service. And if it doesn't meet the specs, you replace that part at that time. So it's an on-condition test where you're testing more components than the overhaul would, because you're doing more of the whole aircraft system at that point, to where you can replace the parts that are as needed, that are worn out to replace, and you can continue operating the engine or the majority of the aircraft until it needs to be replaced. So overall it's a better system than setting an arbitrary time limit, which could be the majority of the aircraft could be still very good to operate. Or the data has shown, there's a lot of articles out there that TBO is really arbitrary at that point, because there are also a lot of articles that show that the time where an engine is most vulnerable to failure is the first 100 to 150 hours after an overhaul. So increasing the amount in which aircraft are overhauled, there could be an argument made that you're going to see more engine failures due to the increased overhaul, because there's this period of time when the engine is breaking in where the components that weren't replaced, or areas of the engine that weren't inspected, may fail at that time, which leads to an increase in engine failure. So there's just a lot of data to show that these TBO doesn't need to be followed, and that the on-condition testing is an actual more reliable way to maintain an aircraft.
The big piece that the FAA cited, if we dial back 12 years ago, is that at that point, and still to this day, there's no statistical evidence that shows that an aircraft that's properly maintained to the current FAA Part 91 regulations is in any way unsafe, right? And if you look at any of the accidents that have occurred, it shows that there's no safety data that supports that these additional regulations would have had any significant impact on past accidents, or that they would provide additional safety against any future ones occurring.
So when you talk to these senators that are trying to push this through, what is their response to that?
It's hard, really. The information that we've provided to them, and any of our USPA members are welcome to see a shortened summary of that, which is on our call to action page on USPA.org. They haven't really had a strong argument against the nationwide statistics that we provide. There is certainly, if you look at it, you will see a blip in 2019 where there was a crash in Hawaii, and in their minds that is the end all be all, right? And of course, over the course of a period of time, if you look at that, it certainly affects the overall. But when they look at it, that is all they're looking at, and that's all they care about, is that one incident that occurred. And they don't necessarily have a response to these other than there was an accident in Hawaii, and changes need to be made, right? Regardless of what those are, they're looking to make that change and hold someone accountable for what occurred.
They want a political win.
That's what it appears. Yeah.
Okay, so what can we do about it? I know that USPA has kind of built a website with a form. You want to talk about that a little bit, about what listeners can do to?
Sure. And I don't want to come across as directing this at one person. I mean, when that crash occurred, the initial reports that came out on the media said that an engine failed on that aircraft. So as we all know, when the media puts something out there, that heavily drives public opinion. That was the initial report that came out. But if we wait and we see what the NTSB report stated in it, which took the better part of 2 years to be finalized, which is not uncommon, that's pretty normal. We see that the primary cause of that action was failure, was in part due to the failure of the pilot and the way the pilot acted and reacted to what was going on with that aircraft. So there were some other secondary things that were mentioned in there and some other recommendations that were in there, but that was the primary cause as they saw it. So what we're doing now really is, and this has been a long-term effort from USPA. We started engaging with the senator back in 2020. And more recently, we've had discussions with various legislators and different committees on the House side and on the Senate side, where we're doing our best as an organization to educate all of those folks on the facts, on the data, what it shows, what it says will work, what it says will not work, and the best path forward to really bring forward safety initiatives that can hopefully make a big difference. More recently, we've reached out and we've done our best to get our members involved. We've set up a site on USPA's USPA.org /call-to-action. We can put a link to it in the chat. And that
let me just jump in for a minute and just say the easier way is just go to USPA.org and there's a big red banner across the top. That's easy to remember. USPA.org, click on the big red banner right on the top there.
Sure, and from there that'll take you to the page, and there is depending on how much you want to read, there is a lot of data on there, a lot of information, but there's a little red button at the bottom that says Act Now, and that will bring you to a page that will allow you to send an email to your senator. It will, but based on your zip code, will tell you who your senator and House representatives are, and it will email them directly for you, letting them know that you oppose this bill. We've also engaged with our drop zone operators around the U.S. And asked them to contact their local legislators via email and over the phone as well, and let them know how this potential legislation would affect their business as employers in their state. What this would do to their business, and it's pretty safe to say that the idea that as someone who's running a Cessna 182 drop zone, if that TBO requirement were to go through, and he had an engine that was, say, over 1,500 hours, and he was immediately required to overhaul that engine, which might cost him $30,000, that might seriously affect his ability to stay in business and continue to employ the people he employs and bring in the economic impact that he brings in. And that's on the small operator side. On the larger operator side, some of them may be able to afford to do it, some of them may not, but guaranteed it will change the costs associated with their doing business, and arguably, based on the facts and data we've seen, wouldn't necessarily bring additional safety. So if you have those contacts and you have those communications, and at this point, we're trying to get our members to have their voice be heard. Those folks that sit on the House and on the Senate side of things, they represent the people, their constituents in their region. So let them know your opinion on it.
And where is the process at now? What is the next step?
Yeah, so currently I think Michael had mentioned the House has met and done the markup on their version of FAA reauthorization. The Senate is waiting to do theirs. They've tried to schedule it. They're having some struggles on some of the hot button topics in FAA reauthorization. And as much as I'd like it to be ours, there's some other things in FAA reauthorization that are a bit more contentious and affect commercial aviation and things like that. They have differences of opinion on. They're currently all in recess right now through the month of August. So many of those representatives are back in their home states or traveling, and they'll be back some as early as next week. And then they'll most likely look to schedule that markup on the Senate side of the bill. And then once that happens, there is currently an amendment that's been put in by Senator Budd out of North Carolina. And his amendment is to strike Section 315 in its entirety from the Senate draft. That is, and that would include all the air tour language, all the general aviation language that's in there as well as all the sport parachuting language. So we are supporting that effort, and we hope that Senator Budd's amendment to strike all of that language will be well received and will be accepted. He's a big supporter of general aviation, and we are supporting him in his efforts to strike that section. So from there, depending on what happens on the Senate side of things, then the House and the Senate will go into conference, and any differences in their two drafts, they'll have to make an agreement on, right? They'll concede to one or to the other to come up with a final FAA reauthorization bill. And our hopes that if the Senate doesn't strike it in their markup, that when it goes to conference, it'll be removed.
And in your experience with working with the government, these kinds of write-in campaigns, or not write-in campaigns, but campaigns to email your legislature, is that about the most effective thing that we can do as members?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that work, and there's a lot of ways you can work within that system. And our role, USPA's role in it, is doing our best to educate those legislators, bring them the facts and bring them the data. That's what we can do as an organization. And as far as members go, yes, let them know, email them, call them if appropriate, send them an email, send them another email later when it goes to conference. If you sent one and it's been more than 30 days, feel free to send another one to them. Let them know that you oppose this, and then it will have a negative effect on whether it be your business, your personal life, whatever it is. If you're in their district and they represent you, then let them know what your opinion is on it. And yeah, they do listen to it. They have you most likely won't, unless you have a personal relationship, you probably won't speak to your senator, but the folks that work in their office, they keep track of the calls, they keep track of the emails that come in as far as who is for and who is against various pieces of legislation that are being proposed. As you can imagine, they get calls on various topics to do with just about everything. So the more they hear that people in their region and in their community care about this and are opposed to it, then they will see it as a topic that they need to take up.
Well, you guys have made it very easy to do this. I did it about 3 weeks ago. I went to USPA.org. I clicked on that red banner. I went to the bottom and clicked on that form, and it took me maybe a minute to fill it out, but that's because I kind of read through it. I feel like really I probably could have done it in less than a minute. It was very easy. And I got responses back from all my representatives from just that one little 1 minute of work. It went to all of them, and they all acknowledged receipt of that. So I sure appreciate you guys making that so easy for us. And I hope everybody that's listening to this now will consider going to USPA.org and clicking on that banner and doing the same thing.
Yeah, for us, it's I mean, some folks you can click through and send that email. It'll take you about 20 to 30 seconds. It's a couple clicks. But for us, it's also about educating folks and making sure we educate our legislators and everyone involved in it. So we've put a lot of information and a lot of data up there, including some of the communications that we've sent through to legislators to let them know. And we're open to having those conversations. You know, some of them are difficult when it comes to what needs to be done and what regulations need to be put forward and how to improve safety in the sport. And some of them aren't easy. You know, some of them are things that we as a community may be difficult for us, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's our role as an organization and it's our role as a community to do everything that we can to make the sport safer for all of us who are participating in skydiving, as well as the general public and folks who might be on an airport or an airfield. So that's our goal.
Yep. And one thing to mention, I think that maybe we haven't covered, that Albert and I are continuously meeting with senators' offices, representatives' offices. I mean, we have meetings tomorrow. We have meetings next week. We've been doing this for months and months now. We've been meeting with as many Senate offices that will hear us, and we also a number of offices that don't want to hear us, but we keep banging on the door, and we've been meeting with them and expressing our opinions and sharing the data with a lot of representatives that are either in these committees or going to be on the conferences or have a voice in these topics. We've been trying to meet with as many as we can and express our views on this, to really represent our membership on this issue and to do what we can. But it's been a constant process. It's that we've been doing for months and months now, to meet with a lot of different offices. And we've gotten some positive feedback from it, but we've definitely been meeting with a lot of offices that, you know, so not only now when these members are contacting these offices, it helps you know, solidify the argument and the position that we've been expressing to those offices as an organization, but to have members drive that point home is really helpful as well. So we appreciate everybody helping us out.
Well, as a USPA member, I'm sorry, go Albert.
It's funny, as Michael says that, and we're having this conversation, one of the invitation requests for next week popped into my screen for for a representative's office for a meeting early next week.
Well, as a USPA member, I want to thank you guys for doing that. I feel like USPA does a lot of stuff for the sport, but I personally feel that the government relations stuff is really one of the most important things that the organization does. So I really want to express my thanks to both of you for all the work that you're doing. Have we summarized pretty much everything? Should we go to questions now? Is there anything else that you guys want to talk about before we open it up for questions?
Yeah, I mean, just one thing to cover, and I know I see a comment in there about it right now, but the other thing that I want to express my gratitude for and appreciation for is all the members that do have connections to political offices or representatives that have offered to contact them. They may know these representatives directly, or have a connection to them in some way or another. And that personal connection, that's something we don't have. And then if they're able to connect a representative and directly share that with them, that has been some of the best support we've gotten is from current members who've seen our outreach efforts and then called and said, hey, I know this senator, I know this representative, I can get to him. And we're like, yes, please talk to them, share it, express how this will negatively affect the operation that you're involved in. This will negatively affect skydiving as a whole. This will drastically impact your life in a negative way. You know, and then those members that have really reached out have probably been some of the best support that we've gotten, and also probably the best results. And so anybody out there, that all those people that have these political connections, we really appreciate those. We welcome them to bring us in to those meetings if they want to help, you know, solidify the position that they're doing. But I'm just saying, I know some of them are even in this meeting, and it's been tremendous the help that they've provided in this process as well. So we really appreciate that.
All right. Well, so I would like to move to questions now, and anybody that's that has a question, you can please just put that in the chat, and Shannon's going to be forwarding those to me. The first one is from Fred Olson, and he says, does a BFR, that's a biannual flight review for commercial pilots, cover parachute operations such as spotting and safety for entangled jumpers? So you guys want to, he's asking, I think, to summarize, is it skydiving industry specific when we do a biannual flight review?
Well, Dave, you're probably the best one to answer that as a jump pilot.
I'm the host. I
know, but I was just saying that you're, as an active jump pilot, you're doing jump pilot, but we would all, know those specific topics, unless, you get an instructor or the one doing the review, and you express that you're a jump pilot, and that reviewer could cover those topics in a way to make sure that you are educated and you're proficient in those areas, and that would be helpful. And we would, obviously, I think that would be good if that instructor doing the review did cover those options in there, but it's not set in stone or required for them to do that. No.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, to be fair to that question, most CFIs probably know nothing about the skydiving industry. So they're probably not in a position to really give you that. Not only is it not part of a biannual flight review, but like that guy probably doesn't know anything about it unless he's a jumper or a jump pilot. But I will say that that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. It behooves the drop zone owners to have programs like that in place. Like, I can speak for us here at Eagle Air. We do this every year. We do recurrent training with all of our pilots, and we cover all that stuff. And we go up with airplanes and we shut engines down. We do all kinds of emergency procedures. And so that is, I would say that is more a drop zone to drop zone issue though. And if you're at a drop zone and you're concerned about that, maybe talk to your DZO about it, or your chief pilot, and ask them, hey, what are you guys doing to have kind of continued education? The truth is, if you can keep a guy for a year, you're probably doing pretty good. I mean, at least at the turbine centers, the turnover, it's kind of a stepping stone job for a lot of people, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Let's see. Also, we've got another one from Fred Olson here. These are all from Fred Olson. Fred's got a lot of questions here. Um, when we come on board as USPA licensed skydivers, we move through a licensing program from amateurs to master skydivers. And once we want to move to instructors, we gain specialized knowledge for each segment of what we want to teach. There are 4 items that we need to show annually to renew our instructional rating. Why would we not require that of our pilots? It's a fair question. What do you guys have to say about that?
Well, the jump pilot or the pilot requirements are all mandated by the FAA. Even if the USPA was to put all those in like they were for the instructors, they could never be regulated in a way by the USPA, where the USPA has no regulatory authority over pilots, and that would all need to be done through the FAA specifically, because even if the USPA did, if a jump operator chose not to want to comply with the USPA's new requirement, they could just simply stop being a part of the USPA. And we're not trying to drive members away, because that's not going to increase safety either. So our goal is to increase safety in the ways that we can have an impact.
Well, I'm not in Fred's brain, but I think there's a possibility that what he's asking is, why are we pushing back against this? Why wouldn't we want FAA to take on this thing? I think maybe that's what he's asking.
Yeah, I think it's a good question and a valid question of why don't we put why don't we put these steps in place? You know, maybe they'll keep an accident from happening in the future. The challenge that we're facing is that they're being proposed based on an event that occurred, when that event doesn't actually justify the action that's being taken. So it's saying that we need to do these things, and we need to put these things in place because of what occurred. And unfortunately, those things don't actually tie together. And the data and the analysis doesn't show that taking these steps would have changed the outcome of the one specific one that is the catalyst for this, or any of the other accidents or fatal accidents that occurred in the sport of skydiving in the last decade or so. So I get it. It's the idea of it's a solution looking for a problem, rather than a fact-based and analysis-based decision to resolve something that the facts and analysis and data lead us to making a change of. I hope that makes sense.
Okay. A reminder for those of you, I think we still got about 19 people in the room here. If anybody else has questions, please feel free to add them. I have one more here from Fred, and then I think that's about all we have. He says, looking at the TBO portion in the math on the fact sheet, it appears that the overhaul would never be done. In doing some research, it looks like an overhaul is usually done within 500 hours of the TBO. Isn't then the TBO requirement only increasing the maintenance dollars by 25%, not by the full overhaul cost? I think what he's saying, I think maybe what I hear him saying here is, it's not like doing it at TBO, like it's not like being relieved from doing it at TBO means you don't have to ever do it. And so it's not really the full cost of it. It's sort of a prorated cost. Does that make sense? Like if your engine can make it 25 to 50% beyond TBO, that's really the added cost. It's not it's not like you're having to take on the entire cost that you wouldn't otherwise be taking on. Does that make sense? Am I asking that correctly?
Yeah. And the other, I think the portion of the bill that we haven't really covered in this is that the requirement to follow service bulletins, and as well as TBO, to where this bill, the way it's written now, would give the regulatory authority of jump aircraft to the engine manufacturers and the aircraft manufacturers. It would allow the ability to, the engine manufacturer could simply issue a service bulletin that says TBO for jump aircraft is now 1,000 hours. And that wouldn't involve the FAA in any way. the FAA would no longer have any say in that. The manufacturer wouldn't have to supply data for that. They could simply just say, hey, it's better for our bottom line if these jump operators have to TBO have to overhaul their engines at TBO, and we can now reduce that TBO to any number that they choose in the future. So it's not going to, this still allows them to not necessarily leave it at 1,500 hours. They could issue a service bulletin that says if you're a jump operator, it's now 1,000. Yeah.
I think it might be appropriate for us to kind of explain the difference between a service bulletin and an airworthiness directive. Can you maybe define both those items, and then maybe what you're talking about will make a little more sense to those listening?
Well, an airworthiness directive is issued by the FAA, but it's in collaboration with the manufacturer. The manufacturer and the FAA have seen data on an issue that has been happening within the industry, and it's kind of like a recall for your car. I mean, but this one involves, so an airworthiness directive, there's a problem, everybody sees the problem, the FAA, so they issue the airworthiness directive, and that becomes a requirement that must be complied with at the next maintenance cycle, whenever that may be, and some are immediate. It's whatever the FAA says, and it must be complied. A service bulletin for a Part 91 operator is issued, and you're not forced to comply with it. It's left up to the operator and their decision with their maintenance facility on whether they believe they need to comply with it, or whether it doesn't apply to their aircraft at all. So,
and a service bulletin can just be issued by any manufacturer, whereas an AD has much more due process involved in it. Is that fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, there's a, what do they call it? There's a public like a public comment period to ADs where other people weigh in on it, and all that, while a service bulletin just comes from the manufacturer and is out there. But this would now give that authority to the manufacturer and skip the AD process to where they could just issue a service bulletin that relates specifically to jump aircraft, and it would be required to comply with now for jump aircraft. And it could change the TBO limits, it could change other components of the system as well. And again, they would have control over that without involvement from the FAA. So that's another kind of a turn of this that doesn't really get explained specifically in the language, but is, to me, would be very concerning as an operator.
You can almost imagine, you can imagine a world where somebody like Pratt and Whitney or a aircraft manufacturer could say, boy, we'd like to unload this liability of the jump industry. Let's send out some service bulletins that are going to make it real difficult on them. Seems like there could be a little bit of a conflict of interest there.
And it could dictate where the overhauls can occur, what shops are allowed to overhaul them, what parts are allowed to be used, no OEM parts, only FAT manufacturer approved parts. It could be a lot of other components to this that aren't seen. So that's in the current language. That's the way it's currently written. It could lead to a slippery slope of a lot of things that can be easily understood. And that's why, the current way it's written, there's a lot of concern with that specific recommendation. So, yeah.
I just want to jump in out here from Arizona and first of all, thank the USPA team, the two of you, Michael and Albert, for the really getting after it early on this and doing the hard work. And you gotta make a lot of calls and shake a lot of hands, and you guys are doing that. And as much and the emails you've sent have been super easy to use to log in and send a message to prospective senators. So great going on that. I have to sign off here in a minute, but again, I just want to thank you guys for the proactive amount. This is a classic example of just bad legislation. I wouldn't call it pork, but it's it's trying to throw a Band-Aid on something that happened and going about it entirely the wrong way. So if we stay the course here, I think the results will be good. I think there's people that are really getting this at the legislative area, but thank goodness companies like Cessna, they're focused on their jets. It's, if you talk to people at Cessna, it's like, we're a jet company, and I would be surprised if a company like that would want to be sending out a bunch of OEM, changes. They've got bigger fish to fry, but regardless, well, we got to keep on it. We're coming down to the wire here, and Godspeed. Thank you.
Okay, that was Brian O'Connor. We appreciate you chiming in on that, Brian. We do have one more comment from Michael Davis. He says, we at CPI have been operating since the 60s and our budget is an annual concern. We need no more legislation imposed that would further hamper operations, of which safety has always been our top concern. And I think that's really ultimately what the overall story we've been trying to get to tonight is. That's a pretty good summary of it. Would you agree?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And yeah, that very well sums it up. And the folks at CPI, yeah, you guys have been around for a long time, and all of us as part of USPA are charged with making sure that our sport remains as safe as it can be. We've got everything to lose when it comes to making sure this sport is as safe as it can be. So appreciate everybody's involvement in it and keeping moving forward with this.
Yeah, I see we are running out of time here, so I think maybe we're going to start wrapping things up. But if anybody has additional questions, you can reach out to either Michael Knight or Albert Berchtold directly at USPA, and I'm sure both of them will be happy to go into more detail with any other questions you may have.
Absolutely.
Is there anything else you guys want to chat? I know I'm going to plug Parachutists now. You asked me to plug Parachutists, so I don't know why I'm plugging a magazine that I have to get. I'm not quite sure how this works, but in the August issue, let's see, we've got an article on the board meeting. We've got some great pictorials, and then there's an article on the Aloha Spirit, and maybe the fact that there's jumping still happening at Dillingham. Is that kind of what that's about?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It was actually written by Ed Scott, our previous executive director, to me. And when we went through all the stuff going on out at Dillingham after that crash, and there was a lot of local legislation that went on as well, and there were efforts to shut down jumping in Dillingham. And a lot of you may remember the efforts USPA put in to work the local issue there, along with our friends at AOPA. And we were able to make it so jumping could remain out there at Dillingham. And there were some issues with Army negotiations and property ownership and leases and things like that. And there were some folks that had some struggle with that, because shortly after that happened, a lot of the drop zones out there didn't allow fun jumping, and that struck a lot of people as a very difficult thing. And our point was that our goal was to save skydiving there in whatever form it would be, because if it was lost, it would probably never come back. And our goal is to make sure airport access stays available to all of skydiving and any part of it at all airports where it's rightfully belongs. So that article talks about how some of the more recent changes and ownership has changed at one of those local drop zones, and where there was no fun jumping, now there is again. So happy to see that come back around, and people can head back out there. They actually just set some head down big way records out there in Dillingham, so that was pretty cool too.
All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our talk this evening. Thanks very much to both Albert Berchtold and Michael Knight and USPA for all the work that you guys do. And thank you for all of those who joined and had questions. We sure appreciate it.
Thanks everybody for joining in, and thank you, Dave, for hosting. Appreciate you working with us on this.
Anytime. We'll see y'all later.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks everybody.